The Odd Couple got a lot of cheers. I guess we have a lot of people from New York here who grew up watching it 7 times a day on Channel 11. And if you saw my talk yesterday, I don't want to disappoint you too much today. I didn't really write any jokes for this one. So this is going to be pretty serious. It's going to be deadly serious. You saw that the title of our presentation. Our primary goal was to really understand what the impact of less commercials in primetime on our network was going to be. I mean, the background is that truTV last year at the beginning of the television season cut national commercials in half for all of our newly produced episodes. There are a lot of reasons why we at Turner chose truTV for this. Probably the most compelling is that it's a network of primarily originally produced content, which means that you can flip a switch tomorrow and tell your producers to reformat their programs for fewer commercials. If you've got acquired programming, it's obviously really hard to reformat when you don't have content to fill in those gaps. The other thing that was really great for us, for Brian's team and my team, is because these were original episodes of our own series, we actually had the opportunity to compare back to previous seasons of the same exact series and look at things like commercial retention, which Brian will talk to you about. So we had a program of research that we conducted, both of our teams, over the course of a year, where we looked at program enjoyment, advertising recall, audience retention, as well as sales effect. So I'm going to turn it over to Brian to take you through the first 3, and then I'll come back and talk to you about sales effect.
Great.
Brian?
Great. Thanks, Mark. Yeah, as Mark talked about, it's interesting. Late 2016, ad sales came to truTV management and said, "We'd like to cut your advertising." And as you can imagine, there was like, what? Never in the history of anybody had we heard we wanted less commercials on air. So it was great. But it also presented a bit of a challenge for truTV, as to Mark's point, it's all original content, but when we started off, we were going to have to create 24.5-minute episodes and 21-minute episodes for repeats throughout the schedule. So it was a bit more work. So we really needed to understand, was this the right thing to do, both for advertisers and also for our audience? As Mark mentioned, we were coming off this rebrand. It had been pretty successful as we pivoted towards comedy, and it was an opportunity to, ad sales wanted to further make the air a little more premium looking. As we moved away from shows like Lizard Lick Towing, it's not that hard to make the air a little more, but it was an opportunity to give good advertisers that opportunity to be in a more premium environment, and ultimately obviously pay a little more. So we set out to test shows. We compared shows, a control group, but with programs with that 24.5 minutes of content, right? We called it more story. And what we saw was, we saw respondents say that they liked the show, they enjoyed the show more. Top 2 Box outperformed the normal load, not just on day of, but we recontacted them and we heard that we saw the same measurement, right? The same differences in LCI and normal load. We dug in a little deeper, and what we saw things were pacing. People weren't able to say, "Oh, there's less commercials, I like this show more," right? But what we did see is people were able to say specifically about the show, not even about the commercial breaks. The pacing of the show was tighter. The show felt a little more premium when we compared it. So we knew we had something, and little fonts. We also, what was kind of cool is people were also, they were able to say that the network itself had a little more cachet, right? When we recontacted people, we saw a higher rate of people actually checking out the network in their free time when they weren't being paid to do research. And also, they were interested, they felt like the brand was more premium. So that idea of taking off some of the advertising, gave them a sense that the brand was a little more premium. We launched this in fourth quarter 16. And so we had a year of limited commercial, like I said, and it ran throughout all of our new programs, what we call our breakout hours. So the repeats didn't happen, so we were able to compare. But we were also able to look at year versus year, shows that had the limited commercial, shows that didn't have the limited commercial. We looked to see, as you can imagine, we saw that the commercial delivery ratings across all commercial pods were higher by 8% than the previous year. So that was like that real tangible, nice moment. We knew that there was a positive effect, but was that going to really translate to ratings? And it did. And then that carried across our program delivery. We were able to then go back to look at what our commercial index, what the retention of commercial was prior to the LCI, and current, and project back to what our ratings would have been, right? So we saw a ratings lift across all of our premieres, all those premium LCI programs. We saw another 2% lift, which, as we've been facing ratings challenges as most networks, that 2% is really meaningful. But it wasn't just the shows and it wasn't just the brand. We knew that there was going to be an advertising effect, right? You have less commercials, there's going to probably be a better brand recall, and we did see that, and that was something we were able to take to advertisers. More than that, though, we were able to talk about purchase intent. Purchase intent, we saw increases. And throughout all this testing, female and 18 to 34. Now, the 18 to 34 made sense to us. As we figured, less commercials, younger viewers have been, trained in streaming platforms, different things where there's a sense of less or no commercials. The female, most people don't think of this, especially because of our old programming, but we're a pretty 50-50 network. So the female was a surprise, I think, to advertisers, but it wasn't really to us. We saw some impact there. But at the end of the day, we knew that intent, after a year of this, the idea of intent, the idea of here's what people said all on paper before the experiment was one thing, but really showing advertisers what was the effect, what was the real purchase behavior changes. And so I'll bring Mark up to talk about that stuff.
Thanks, Brian.
Sure.
I think any of us who've been in ad sales research for any amount of time have heard the complaints from advertisers and from media agencies that there's too much clutter, there are too many commercials. Now, the issue has always been, though, that the math doesn't work out. If you want to cut your commercials in half, it's really simple math to know how much you have to increase your CPMs and your unit costs in order to stay whole in terms of your revenue. Now, the numbers that you saw here from Brian from the survey data were great, but the math doesn't work out if you're going to try and charge double the CPM on a 30% unaided brand recall increase. So that's really always been, I think, the math of this. We have done research in the past. I think any of us who've done research on streaming full episodes, when we used to have half the commercials, you wouldn't get twice the ad recall. We didn't get twice the ad recall here. But what we do have now that we didn't have 10 years ago or 12 years ago are much bigger single source panels. And Peter's here. We worked with Peter's team from NCS. We worked with NBI, where we actually are able to take a look at what was the sales lift pre and post campaign, excuse me, and we could compare that to the top 25 cable networks. So that was our control group. We looked at truTV, LCI episodes, exposed viewers within those episodes, and compared those to viewers who were also exposed in prime time on the top 25 cable networks. And these were the categories we had. QSR, we used NBI to measure sales lift. NCS, soft drinks and snacks. And if any of you worked in, we can talk later about how the control groups are actually created, but there are a multitude of household matching characteristics that are used in order that we can isolate ad impact. Now, the first category we looked at, and one of the things that we typically do, any of you who do these analyses, we usually look at return on ad spend, and I can assure you that the return on ad spend numbers for truTV were extraordinarily positive, the kind of things we don't normally see in terms of $4 or $5, even higher in terms of each dollar of spent on advertising. But in order to make a fair comparison, we didn't actually have the ad spend for this QSR brand on we only had the published ad spend numbers for our competitors. So in order to keep those not constant, but in order to take out the difference in pricing, we actually compared lift per rating point. So for each rating point of exposure, you can see that in the truTV LCI exposed group, there was almost $40,000 in incremental sales for these QSR category brands compared to about $2,500 for the top 25 cable networks. That's a number that our friends at Nielsen actually took the data back to make sure that it was right. It looked so out of whack to them that they did go back, verify that these are actual real numbers. The other good news, the 2,500 doesn't look really big in terms of incremental sales per rating point, but I can also assure you that that is a positive return on ad spend number as well. So the bottom line here is even on networks with more commercials, television advertising, it works. Who knew? Who knew? It works across the board. It does work better if you have less commercialization in your networks and people recall the ads better. Here's the snacks category, the salty snacks category actually. $122,000 per rating point of exposure to just over $30,000 in the competitive set. Once again, those are great numbers across the board, just better and higher when we had fewer ads. Now, the other thing that I did when we looked at, one of the things we wanted to do was look more closely network by network, just to see if, we took the top 25 as an aggregate, were there other networks that performed as well? It turned out in a couple of cases there were a couple other networks that did about as well, but they tended to be less commercialized themselves. And so this was a case study. We only did 5 of these analyses. Again, you have to be in the categories where we have the sales data. And so I don't want to pretend that this is a rule or this is something that we saw in millions and millions of cases. Looked at 5 different categories. In 3 cases, we saw the kind of correlation you're going to see here between total non-program material as published by Nielsen for the top 25 cable networks. And then we looked at incremental sales per household among viewers exposed on each of those networks. In 3 of the cases, we saw really very, very strong correlations, and I'll show that to you for the soft drink category. In 2 of the cases, we saw no correlation, and it turned out that there wasn't any real discrimination network to network. One was a brand that got very, very small incremental sales per household across all networks. The other was a brand that did very well and got very high incremental sales across all networks. So in the 3 cases where we actually saw discrimination across networks, the pattern was all the same. So I think this is just something that I think we should, as an industry, really take a closer look at. Because again, just a handful of case studies, but here you can see this was the soft drink category. TruTV was delivering 79 cents per household in incremental sales. The top 25 competitive average was 41 cents. Once again, television advertising works. And we can see here on the next page what the incremental sales per rating point were. It was over 370,000 for TruTV, 34,000 for the competitive set. Now, one of the things I did not want to do here, I don't want to call out any individual networks. So we took all of the network names off here to protect the guilty. But this is the published Nielsen total non-program material in primetime. This is on the far right. And you can see there, when you cut the national commercials in half, you end up with, when you add back in the promos and the local commercial time, the lowest in primetime were those LCI episodes. And you can see when I looked at the spreadsheet that the NCS folks delivered to me, I didn't really even need to do a calculation. You can see that it just eyeballing it, the correlation starts to jump out at you. And if you put it on a scatter plot, you can see you have a correlation of negative 0.62, which is the more commercials, the fewer incremental incremental product sales. And the reverse, if you have fewer commercials, I did decide to identify one of the other networks because it's also a Turner network. Adult Swim and TruTV delivered the same incremental sales lift per household. And again, I'm not going to pretend that this is the definitive word on it because it's a really gross metric if you think about it. I actually did not have the individual programs that all these ads ran in. I'm just taking the average for the network. And we still got this correlation. I think if we really could get really granular and know how many commercial minutes were in each episode of each placement, this might actually be a stronger relationship, or it could be less. But just, to put an exclamation point on this, no exclamation points, but a figurative exclamation point, we did have significant effects from cutting the national commercials. Some of the things were no-brainers. We knew that if you have fewer brands in each episode, people are going to be able to remember them better, and they did. But we also figured that, or we were hopeful that viewers would watch longer and stay through the commercial breaks, and in fact they did. Brian showed you that. And then we had our case studies here. It's a handful of categories because they have to be the categories where we have single source viewing and sales data. But we saw really strong results across the board for the categories that we looked at. Now, I didn't put it in writing because I know we're going to post this on the ARF. We're not at the ARF. We're going to post it on the Media Insights. I'm so sorry. And I'm not. I have a bone to pick with them. They don't like my studies as much as you guys do. But anyway, I didn't want to put it here in writing because we do have some hypotheses about. But again, it's a handful of case studies, so I'd rather just talk them out with you, which is these are categories we're looking at really frequent purchase cycles. It's QSR, it's snacks, it's soft drinks. It's the kind of thing that if you remember an ad last night, you might be very apt to buy something today or tomorrow. So we looked at categories where the purchase cycle is very frequent, the price points are relatively low, and most of these kind of ads are trying to get you to buy now or buy soon. It's not necessarily about brand building. If you're a QSR, you probably have a promotion that you're putting in front of people. So we feel like we need to do more to understand how other categories work in this space. When you're building a brand, it's probably more impactful if there are fewer ads, but we're having a harder time, I think, demonstrating incremental sales in the time of the campaign. But for these categories, within those characteristics that I mentioned, we're seeing really, really strong results. And we're going to be continuing to monitor that as we go forward, and more of our programming has this lower commercial load. So that's it. That's our last page. I think we're way ahead of schedule. So if you have questions, we're willing to